originality and uniqueness are very difficult concepts to grasp fully, and even more difficult to reliably measure. It's a very abstract and relative concept, which is probably the reason why we don't have a stable and reliable definition of it. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines originality as the quality or state of being original, and freshness of aspect, design, or style. It defines original as being the first instance or source from which a copy, reproduction, or translation is or can be made, and independent and creative in thought and action. Unique is defined as being the only one, being without like or equal or distinctly characteristic. As you can see, the definitions are very abstract and very open to interpretation, especially if you're aware of how easily meaning of words can be stretched, changed, or flipped on its head. This leaves us with a genuine problem, that anyone can claim anything is original, to a certain degree. People really like to stretch the meanings of these words, and not only these words, but any other abstract words and concepts which are used to attribute positive qualities to their favorite games. It's only natural. It's psychology after all. The fundamental attribution error. Although it primarily focuses on people and attributing qualities to those people, for example, we tend to think that just because a person is beautiful, that person must also be good. We can also use it outside that context when it comes to things. We can see this same error used with video games. When people like a video game, they'll try to make that game look better than it really is in their minds. It's not that uncommon to automatically get offended as if someone was attacking you if they were criticizing your favorite game. In short, when you like a thing, you make excuses for that thing. Because you like a game, that game is better in your eyes than it really is. There is another error of attribution we need to look out for in this discussion: equating good and unique. To put it bluntly, although many of us might think so, a good game isn't necessarily a unique game, nor does a game need to be unique to be good. To give you an example, The Witcher 3 is a great game, one of the greatest games of all time, but it isn't very original, especially not by Kant's framework, which I'll get to shortly. But simply put, The Witcher isn't a completely new genre. Its story is of the fantasy genre, and to my knowledge, it didn't make much innovation within that space. Although every story is unique to some degree, this one did nothing so unique that it redefined a genre, or even started a new one. Same for the gameplay, it is by no means unique. It follows quite a standard open world formula, which has been around forever at this point. Although it's true that the game has some unique parts, when you look at it as a whole, it really isn't. But despite all of this, The Witcher 3 is still a great and beloved game, just not a unique one. The thing I wanted to emphasize with this example was that uniqueness on its own doesn't make a game great. In fact, sometimes it can even be a bad thing, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. Today it's more important than ever in the wake of countless soulless corporate games and unfaithful remakes. Another thing I want to emphasize is that there are levels to this. It's a whole different story when you compare two different games, two games in the same genre, a game and its direct or spiritual sequel, and the game and its remake. Today, I'll try exploring these levels, as well as exploring the concept of uniqueness and originality as a whole, in an attempt to strip it from its abstract veil and make it into something concrete. If you want to join the discussion, feel free to do so in the comments, but with that said, let's begin by first explaining the method which I use to determine if a game is unique or not. Immanuel Kant, a 17th century philosopher, is still well respected and considered by many the greatest philosopher of all time. People mostly focus on his first two critiques, but we'll touch on the third one, as that one presents us with quite an interesting framework for measuring uniqueness of art. I think it's best applied to video games, as they are the most complex form of art we have today. This allows them to be unique in more ways than one. You'll see why that's important in a bit, but first, let's set the scene for this story. At first, we had only paintings and music and literature, all of them separate. Each could be used as a medium to tell a story, and each had specific ways it best achieved the desired effect, be it emotion or moral message. Each one had its own rules, an unwritten set of rules which make a good painting, a good symphony, and a good novel. The works that set those rules, which were the precedent at that time, were unique in Kant's eyes. But I'm sure he doesn't only mean that the work should necessarily inspire a copycat to be unique. So we'll instead consider works which are so different from other works, they deserve their own category, as unique. But getting back to the story of video games. Art evolved. It fused one form and another to create more complex art. It fused paintings, or rather photographs, many of them into a single moving picture, a motion picture. Then they added sound, which also includes music, of course. Now, new rules had to be established for making a good motion picture, and many artists got to work. With the birth of animation, be it drawn or 3D digital, one more component had to be accounted for: the art style. You could argue, of course, that this component can be first found in paintings, and that is true. But now we're covering more and more complex art forms, and animation is just that. It inherits the rules, be it cinematography, storytelling, or others from movies, and adds art style on top of that. When you really think about it, a movie doesn't have an art style in the same way we think of it when we say animation, a manga, or a painting, since movies always include live action elements. You could argue that with the ever more frequent implementation of CGI into movies, that art style becomes more important. But let's leave that discussion for another time. The point is that animation carries its art style throughout its entire runtime, while CGI elements are only in parts of the movie, and they more often than not seek to be realistic as possible, while animation art style can really be anything. And now, at long last, we come to video games, which introduce a completely new component: interactivity. This is a completely new vector, which we stacked onto that pile that I mentioned before. And that's how we reach the current pinnacle of art in terms of complexity. And that complexity allows you to do more things with your story than ever before. We see this in some games, how the story is told through the mechanics and gameplay, how it's told through the music, how it's told through the art style. There are so many ways you can enhance the story. You can bend reality within the 2D or 3D space of the game to really drive a point home, to better explore the themes or whatever else you want to do with your story. For example, Signalis is inspired by retrofuturism, and although the game could have had more pixels and looked better, the whole point was to be a retro game directly tied to its art style. It even has a CRT filter for the ultimate retro experience. I've already talked about Bloodborne in this video, so check it out if you want to. That game purposefully hides its lore and knowledge from you, since the main theme of the game is mystery and the search, or rather the thirst for knowledge and the dangers of that search. Here we see themes and story be implemented into the gameplay and mechanics of a game. Most games don't use these opportunities to tell the story deeper than just the spoken dialogue or massive entries on lore or characters. And as much as I'd like to spend time rambling about that, we have to continue to the main point of this video. The point is that there are so many ways for video games to be unique. It has never been easier actually, since you have so much to play around with. The rules are drastically changed by the addition of interactivity. What works in a movie doesn't necessarily work in a game, and even if it does, it's not using the full potential which that medium holds. The genre that's become more popular than ever in recent years is that of movie games, which mostly includes Sony exclusives and was probably started by The Last of Us. People who are vocal critics of these games criticize exactly the fact that these games are playing by the rules of a movie instead of the rules of a video game. They prioritize the story over gameplay complexity and are usually linear. They have frequent cutscenes and mostly chase a very realistic look. You know the type. It varies from game to game, of course, but there are many of them that really toe that line. Sometimes they really are just interactive movies. But I'm not here to bash those games specifically, so let's just move on and say that the rules of making a game are very specific. All of this was pretty much a very prolonged introduction into what I'll refer to as uniqueness in this video. I won't adapt Kant's framework fully, and I'll use it mostly as a guideline. The only other thing that needs to be mentioned before we proceed to concrete cases is that this framework is inadequate in measuring the uniqueness of a story, as it would consider most titles that fall within a certain genre copies of the one that started that specific genre. Therefore, this is a disclaimer. Whatever is said about the uniqueness of video games in the context of this video excludes their story in terms of plot and characters, although I'll be looking at the lore, worlds, and general structure of certain parts of the story. Like I mentioned before, video games tell a story through various means. The story is essentially woven into a video game and can never be fully removed from it, so therefore it cannot fully be excluded from this judgment. But with all that said, let's finally begin, and let's look at a few actual cases and different ways to apply Kant's principle of uniqueness. Most people today, when they talk about Resident Evil, they're talking about remakes and Village, essentially the new Resident Evil games made on the RE engine. All of these games play very similarly in terms of gunplay and general gameplay mechanics, and are probably the best example for Kant's framework of uniqueness. The game that set this new standard, or rules if you will, is Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Although that game had its own fair share of controversy, especially on release, it was the game that walked so that Resident Evil remakes could run. Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4 remakes and even Resident Evil Village play very similarly to this game, and almost all of them are beloved games, which only shows you that this formula, these rules, work. I'm not gonna go into details of the mechanics of these games since they warrant a whole video dedicated just to them, so don't expect a full analysis since we have many other games to cover. I'm also by no means a Resident Evil expert, so don't attack me in the comments if I say something dumb. Resident Evil 7, to me, is the epitome of survival horror, and probably my favorite Resident Evil game, since it manages to perfectly hit that fine line between survival and horror, more than other games I just mentioned. Although the remake of 2 comes very close, after a certain point you get far more ammo than you will need. In 7, it feels like a struggle throughout the whole game. You really feel like you're barely surviving with what little equipment and supplies you have. Barely scraping by, boss fight to boss fight. When I say that every bullet counts, I mean it literally, and I really liked that feeling, that tight line between too much power, at which point you lose the horror element, and having no power, at which point you lose the survival element. All of the changes that made these new games good, it's all thanks to Resident Evil 7. From the way the shooting works, and how you have to wait a certain time to completely center your gun, to how slow you are and how tight some areas can be, to how the game and the UI looks, etc. It's hard to draw the line what was in the genre before and what changed. But just looking at the older games, 7, and the games that came after just reveal how much of an impact Resident Evil 7 was on the series. Resident Evil 7 is an underrated game which left a legacy which by now far surpasses itself, and is probably the cleanest example of a game setting the rules that other games follow, and by Kant's definition, this game is truly unique. But to measure if something is unique you need to compare it to something else. In this case we compared Resident Evil games which came out before and after 7, and came to the conclusion that I already mentioned. The next chapter will be very short and focuses on why it's impossible, using this framework at least, to compare two games from different genres and decide if they truly are unique. Simply put, if the games are too different, how do you even go by comparing them? You'll end up accepting that both of them are unique when compared to the other, and by that logic, you could make a case for every game to be unique. The only way we could look at their uniqueness overall is by comparing each of them against all other video games, which is practically impossible. Like I said, video games as a medium present many possibilities, and that's exactly why it's so hard to compare a single game against all other video games. Many of them are just too different. That's why I compare them inside a single genre or subgenre. Although Resident Evil is a part of survival horror or, in some cases, action genre, you could make a case that Biohazard inspired a subgenre which contains all of the games I mentioned in the previous chapter. Again, we see Kant's rule applied loosely when talking about a general genre like action-adventure, survival horror, etc., since it's not uncommon to have two completely different games contained in the same genre. Like I keep mentioning, there are so many parameters that determine a video game's identity, and that's why we have so many subgenres. The already mentioned Resident Evil games and Signalis fall in the same genre, which might seem a little weird since these games are so vastly different on a first look. They're a part of that genre because of how they play. A good survival horror game is that which manages to make you scared, despite you being able to fight back. It's defined by its gameplay, but that's not the only way to define a game. We can define it as 2D or 3D, first person or third person, or fixed camera, sandbox or linear, arcade or simulation, character-driven, plot-driven, or lore-driven, etc. This shows us multiple things. 1. Although games might look similar or different on the surface, that's only their surface look. How they play is also very important to the overall experience. As we'll see later, even how they play may look similar on paper, but details might make a huge difference. There's no way to measure this how a game plays parameter, so that's mostly left abstract, for each player to feel. And 2. That gameplay is king, pure and simple. It makes the most difference when it comes to overall game experience. If you're not ready to go through the rage that Dark Souls or Bloodborne may induce in you, you won't continue to play that game no matter how much interesting the lore or the characters or the world is. If the gameplay is boring but you like the story, what stops you from watching the cutscenes online and skipping the overall experience entirely? I hope you got the general gist of this chapter, but let's move on to the other examples. Starting with comparing games within the same genre. Even though I'm sure most people don't really care about strategy games, just stick with the video. Strategy games themselves aren't the point. But if you are a strategy games enthusiast, please know that I haven't played all of the games in the franchises I'm about to mention. I only played those you'll see the footage of, so don't kill me in the comments if I say something wrong. This example will be used to demonstrate how to compare two games of the same genre, and I chose it because it's quite simple. Simply put, 4X games, the subgenre which Civilization is part of, are far more numerous when it comes to how many titles it has compared to Grand Strategy, which are pretty much all of the games that Paradox Interactive makes. This probably has something to do with 4X games being easier to make than Grand Strategy games, which all the good ones are pretty much made by Paradox. They have a monopoly on that genre. This just means that there are more games similar to Civilization than there are to Paradox's Grand Strategy games. As I mentioned, Uniqueness is all about comparison with other games, and if Civ has more other games that are similar to it than Paradox games, the math is simple. To be fair, I haven't played that many 4X games, and I'm sure there are major differences between many of them, but the point still stands. We could go into comparing individual titles, but like I already mentioned, I haven't played all of them, so I can't really comment on it. And like I said in a different example, this is not to take away from Civ 6. There are many parts of it that are very unique compared to its predecessors and other 4X games. However, looking at the bigger picture, Paradox games are much more unique. You won't find another game with so much detail, depth and complexity as Hearts of Iron. You won't find another game that gives you as much freedom and a sandbox to make your own history as Europa Universalis. You won't find a more creative space strategy game that lets you completely customize your empire, spending hours on writing its lore like Stellaris. There aren't any other games that'll offer anything close to the overall experience you'll find in these games, so let's take a closer look at them specifically. Although all of these games play fairly similarly, there are major differences between them. Hearts of Iron 4 is probably the most unique of them, since it has the most complex and in-depth systems, even though it offers questionable sandbox experience, meaning that the world is already kind of set into a certain position which can't easily be changed. Germany, USSR and the US will always be strong and will always have an advantage over other countries. EU4, for example, is much more balanced, although the Ottomans and Muscovy are probably the best starts you can get. But because of its in-depth systems, which are much more complex than any other title I mentioned, I'll say that Hearts of Iron 4 is the most unique of all of these strategy games. Stellaris would probably be the second most unique one, in part because of the setting, being set in space on a much larger scale than any other game, and in part due to the complete open-endedness of the sandbox. Like I already mentioned, you create your own empire and their origins, which can range from playing boring ones to a complete challenge run. Every run carries something different, something random. Sometimes you'll have close neighbors who threaten you with war so your colonization suffers because you decided to raise your defenses. Sometimes you'll be completely alone and free to colonize. Sometimes one of the crises will come early and most of your game progress will be halted. However, this game fears to take a step into a more complex direction like Hoi 4, and most of its mechanics are very surface level. And that's why it can feel very much like other Paradox games, and that's the only reason I put Hoi over it in terms of uniqueness. This game has by far the greatest potential, but at this point it feels like Paradox pulled most of their resources from it and put it onto other projects. As for Crusader Kings 3, or Crusader Kings in general, and Europa Universalis 4, the two play very similarly and there isn't much I can say about that. When you think of Paradox Interactive, you probably think of EU4. I'll assume you know how all of these games work and just move on and say that since EU and CK are so similar, and no, I'm not ignoring the roleplay elements of Crusader Kings, they're the least original games of the Paradox catalog. And I'll say it again, that doesn't mean they're worse than the rest, that only means they're less unique. Although I arguably should have compared Elden Ring to Dark Souls 3 and not Dark Souls 1, since the two are very similar games, I wanted to look at the original of the series and compare it to where it is now. I know there will be some people who'll argue that Demon's Souls is the actual original of the series, and you may be right, but Dark Souls was when FromSoft's fame really started and they found the winning formula, so to speak. They made the rules, as Kant would say, that would go on to inspire hundreds of games, which we now call Souls-likes. I was honestly surprised at the stark difference in gameplay. Now, let me explain. I played Dark Souls for the first time ever just for this video. It amazed me how, although all of the mechanics are pretty much the same except magic, the game just plays so differently. I thought after someone like Malekith and Melania that I've seen all there is to see in the Souls series, but oh how wrong was I. But anyways, this isn't why we're here, so let's just get to the actual comparison. I'm going to assume, like with every game until now, that you know a thing or two about how Elden Ring plays, and I'll focus more on Dark Souls to really highlight the differences. So, is Elden Ring a unique sequel? Well, yes and no. It's very similar to Dark Souls 3 with many of the same animations for both the player and the enemies, but on the other hand, it's an open world game and its world is so much different than any other Dark Souls one. I think that calling Elden Ring Dark Souls 3.5 is a bit harsh, but it is true that it borrows heavily from it. It's in a weird middle ground with the majority of the mechanics pretty much the same. The player speed is also pretty much the same. Some of the story beats are heavily inspired by Dark Souls. Ashes of War and weapon arts are pretty much the same thing. Quests are also unintuitive as ever, and I could keep going on. However, it also has a bunch of new mechanics, mainly the open world. A heavier focus on magic with a great number of spells, a completely different setting with more NPCs, and so on. Because this answer is pretty inconclusive in my opinion, I will compare Elden Ring to Dark Souls 1 instead, if nothing else to highlight how it all started and where the series is now. The first difference you'll notice is the speed, Dark Souls being far slower and methodical, and if you're like me, you won't truly know what that means until you actually try this game. It really makes a huge difference. The second difference are the shields, which aren't paper-like in the sequels. You'll actually be using them a lot because rolling can sometimes be unpredictable when it comes to immunity frames and pretty janky hitboxes. The third difference is how the world is constructed, because Dark Souls is actually constructed similarly to an open world, only with pathways instead of open fields. Traditional Dark Souls design only shines in a few major dungeons in Elden Ring, mainly in Stormveil Castle, meaning it has secret paths or areas, carefully placed enemy encounters, traps, and so on. Well, that traditional design is pretty much the whole of Dark Souls 1, not just parts. And the reason why that's possible is because it isn't as open as Elden Ring. Both are open world, but only one has an open map. Fourth is that Elden Ring feels much more intuitive in where you can go. I've seen people comment things like, if you're struggling in Dark Souls, you're just in the wrong area, something like that anyways. And it's true. since an area which is meant for levels 50 to 70 according to the wiki is accessible pretty much from the start. I always used to gauge how strong the boss of the area is or how difficult the area as a whole is by how difficult the enemies are. If you're struggling against normal enemies, then that's a sign. Dark Souls really stretches that, as there were times where I didn't have any problems fighting normal enemies, but the boss would just stomp me because I wouldn't do enough damage. Elden Ring has a much more open design, where you can go anywhere you want, but it also doesn't allow you to go to the harder areas so soon, except by being teleported by the two chests. I could probably name a few more, but I think you get the picture by now. Elden Ring and Dark Souls play so differently that it amazed me. It's a completely different experience despite having the same core gameplay mechanics, and at its core that's the point of a sequel. Sequels have to be both loyal to its predecessor and unique, so that they're not essentially the same game. When they're too unique, they're too different from its predecessor, which is never a good thing and can anger many fans. We'll observe the same in the next example, with remakes. All my Persona fans surely know by now that I don't think Persona 3 Reload is a very good remake. Although some people get offended by that, I'll still repeat what I always say. It's a good game, just not a good remake. This makes a great example for showing when being too original can be a bad thing, and this is when we're talking about remakes. Here again we see different rules surrounding originality, and they're pretty much the same as with sequels. The game can't be too original, as then it completely cuts ties with the original game. At that point, it becomes less of a remake and more of another game in the old one's skin, only using its name to promote itself. Things are never black and white. By the time studios make remakes of their older games, most of the staff has completely changed. Those aren't the same people. These people have their own ambitions and their own vision or interpretations of the original game. A lot of things can go wrong when it comes to remakes, since they carry the legacy of the original on their back. They can't just make a completely new experience and expect old fans who will be the most excited demographic for that game to like it. Well, that's exactly what happened to Persona 3 Reload. As before, I won't go into specifics and details as you have other YouTube videos which analyze them better than I ever will. As I did in my previous jabs on Reload, I'll focus mostly on differences in art style. Persona 3 is by many considered the first modern Persona title. It was made when Atlus was in a very bad place financially, and it had many features which didn't make a return in future games, including Reload. Persona 3 also has an identity problem, which wasn't fixed by the remake, and it stems from the fact that the game essentially has 4 versions now. The original, FES, which is pretty much the same as the original with the added DLC The Answer, Portable, which has removed mechanics for the real world where it's more like a visual novel, but makes up for it by having a completely different protagonist with a completely different social links, and the newest edition of Reload, which is the remake. By comparing FES and Reload, we can see what an unfaithful remake looks like. A remake that tried to be too unique compared to the original. Although Reload was less trying to be unique and more trying to be like Persona 5, that doesn't matter in this context, since the end product was still something different from the original vision of the game. In terms of art style, the difference is night and day, even when we take into account an expected upgrade in graphics. The tone of the game is just too different. Reload is bright, colorful and saturated, while all the colors in FES are kept tame. One look at the dorm is enough to capture just how different these two games are tonally. FES has so many drawn cutscenes, even if they aren't the quality of those in Reload and are locked at 720p, that's still impressive. Reload, on the other hand, tends to go for a more cheaper option of 3D cinematics, and even when it does drawn scenes, they just feel uninspired when compared to those in FES. Take the intro scene for example. Because of the frequent cuts, with both visual and audio cuts between the protagonist and Yukari, water splashing and music playing, you feel a certain unease from the very start. Not to mention this shot, it's far more creepy than the walking sequence we got in Reload. This just shows you that increased quality isn't everything. There are no fancy cuts in Reload's intro. Compared to FES, it feels bland and corporate. And I could go on, but you get the point. The start of any game is a statement, and FES really makes a statement, while Reload doesn't. Even though I know the story of Persona 3 and I've already played Reload before I played FES, the intro in FES just made me feel excited once again. I've never seen anything like it in any other Persona game. But yeah, getting back to the topic. I hope at least some of you now understand just how different the art styles of these two games are. This shows a negative side of originality. Remakes are always supposed to be faithful to the original to a certain degree, and here we see a game that wanted to be its own thing, as it didn't bother to faithfully adapt the original in terms of tone and art direction, arguably the two most important things for Persona games. There is one last thing I wanted to talk about before I end the video, and that is when something is one of a kind. It's very difficult to apply Kant's framework here because there are no copies of these games. Like the title suggests, they're one of a kind. They are so unique that they have nothing that is similar enough to compare to them. That description is a bit idealistic, because there will always be something to compare to a work, but you get the point. They're games that are just so different from any other game that they stand alone in our minds. There aren't a lot of them, and I certainly haven't played a lot. And again, our eyes can be very deceitful when it comes to these things, because games might look similar or have similar mechanics, yet they might play very differently and be very different experiences overall. Here, I'll name 4 of them, and again, I won't go too deep as all of these games are phenomenal and other people will surely better explain what makes all of these games special. Let's start with a game that is more like an honorable mention, as it has a sequel which I coincidentally haven't played, and that game is Ghost Runner. What separates this game from any other is its gameplay. I've never seen anything like it. You die over and over again until you get a part of the level right. Then you proceed and repeat. Oh, and one hit is enough to kill you. On paper, it's a very simple concept, and the game is hard as it might sound, but it starts very easy and has a very nice learning curve. I've never had a game capture pure feeling of adrenaline and focus like this game had, and I just had to put it here as one of my personal favorites. The next game is Factorio, which I haven't ever finished sadly, mostly because of burnouts, but this game will just make you addicted to it. There won't be a second of your day you don't spend thinking about this game, planning for the next time you play it. What parts of your factory need to be reinforced? What parts have bottlenecks? What raw material deposits have started to run dry? So on and so on. I love this game, even though it's not good for me. The closest I could describe it to would be like a strategy game. I don't know what it is about those games, but time just melts whenever you play them. You start and it's suddenly midnight. It's same with this game, but kind of different. There is no game with this same aesthetic and mechanics. This game is simple yet complex. Although its mechanics might seem simple, it takes a long time and a lot of retries to truly get good at it. And like the rest of the games here, there's nothing I can compare it to. Project Zomboid is a modest indie game which enthralled players since its release, and it's another one-of-a-kind game. This is probably the best zombie game you'll ever play, and you'd never know it from how it looks. Realistic survival mechanics make every run an intense experience. Although there are schemes you can do to increase your chances of survival, you'll never be truly safe. A little bit of bad luck is all you need for your multiple days run to end. Its unconventional controls and the fact that you don't have too much control over your character, especially the shooting, which is completely determined by your character's skill and an abundance of other factors, make it all the more interesting. Everything matters. Is your character sleepy? Pretty much everything you do is slower and less precise. Is your character anxious or panicking? You'll miss a lot of your shots. Is your character hungry? Is he thirsty? Is he sick? Are your wounds infected? All that matters in this game. The uncompromising realism is part of the reason this game makes this list. And the last one, and my personal favorite, the one and only Bloodborne. I already linked my more detailed video on this game, so go check it out if you're interested, but in short, what makes Bloodborne so special is just how unique it is. Mostly by its art style and world, its tone and its themes, and how it implements those themes, which are all directly interwoven into the game. All of its parts are tightly connected not only to tell a story but to give a whole experience. Every part of the game contains little details of its themes, and the game essentially makes you play by its rules without you ever knowing it. You become a pawn for the search for knowledge, or rather the search for the eldritch truth, and only at the end can you choose to stay ignorant and let Gammon free you from the dream, or continue the search by rejecting your humanity. There's a reason we have a legion of lore hunters for this game. It's because this search for knowledge transcended the game and invaded people's personal lives. People are still trying to piece together what exactly happened in this game 10 years after it released, and there is a reason for it. The game really is that good. I'm sorry if I missed a game you thought was original or unique. Feel free to write them in the comments though. If you liked the video, be sure to check out other ones on the channel. Hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.